For the remainder of the slides for this module, we're going to walk you through some of the common properties that are shared by various data objects and by various report elements. So first, at the top underneath the object, you can have the name. Now the name has to be a unique identifier. It cannot be an expression, and it's what you see when you look at it inside of the structure view. Underneath the name is the type. The type tells us the type of object, for example, a word box or a decimal box or a layout node. Again, it cannot be an expression, and you can right-click on the object in the main workspace or in the structure view if you want to edit it without going to the properties panel. For the visibility condition, you're giving a Boolean value that indicates if the object is printed. The Boolean value can be an expression. If this value is populated, let me go ahead and print it out. Otherwise, let me skip this altogether. When we get into the chapter on creating labels, you're going to see us using the visibility condition to hide address labels where there may not be an address to, or there may not be a contact name. Now, all objects are going to have these common object properties that relate to where this object sits on the report. So we'll have an X and Y. The X and Y is the position of the attachment point relative to the parent object. So it's not relative to the report, it's relative to the parent object. And it's not always the upper left corner, it's relative to the attachment point. Remember, the attachment point is the small circle you see. Where is that attachment point? Well, that's going to depend upon your anchor X and your anchor Y settings. Anchor X is where it's anchored along its x-axis, and anchor Y is where it's anchored along its y-axis. If it's 0, 0, you know it's going to be the top left corner. If it's 1, 1, you can see this anchor moving down to the bottom. In my case here, I know that it's not 5 or 0.5, and I can see it's only a quarter of the way across, or 0.25 across. So that matches my anchor X of being 0.5 and my anchor Y of being 0.25. You'll remember that when we dropped it in the exact center in one of the earlier labs and demonstrations, we set my anchor X equal to 5 and my anchor Y equal to 5. And that placed my attachment point in the middle. So within an object, you have your attachment point. Where the attachment point sits relative to the parents is determined by the X and Y properties. And then how large this object is going to be set by the X size property and the Y size property. Now here we have Y size blank. That means it's just going to default to its normal size. And when we put objects out such as horizontal boxes or vertical boxes or stripes, mini pages, you'll often see either the X size or the Y size being set to max, saying use up the maximum amount of space allowed by my parent object. Other important geometry properties, one is alignment. From what end of the parent object do we position the object from? So you can do it near, close, you can do it in the center, you can do it far, you can do it baseline. If you recall back, a right click on an object will bring up, in the work area, will bring up the drop down menu that allows you to change this alignment property. You could also go and change it directly inside of that object's properties panel. If you're dealing with scale X or scale Y, you're either going to stretch or shrink the object using the scale you specified. So if you want it to be half the size, I would set scale X and scale Y equal to 0.5. For the X size adjustment and Y size adjustment, you can override the settings of your X size and Y size and size the object relative to children or parent objects. So you can either shrink it to children or you can expand to parent. Next, we're going to talk about the orientation section. Now, in the orientation section, we have a layout direction and a swap X. The layout direction is telling me the direction of the y-axis. So if you go to the layout direction, you'll see it's a drop-down list box, and it'll say things top to bottom, bottom to top, left to right, right to left. Let's take a quick look at that. So if I go into my layout direction, what you can see is that there's a wide variety of options I get to choose from. Unturned, turn right, upside down, inherit, swapped. There's a few varieties out here. Suggest you look at them and play around with them and see how changing this affects the layout direction. Under swap X, you have a checkbox. So it's a Boolean that says by default, the x-axis is going to be 90 degrees anti-clockwise or counterclockwise to the y-axis. If you check this Boolean, it's going to set the x-axis 90 degrees clockwise of the y-axis. If you click if you click this checkbox so the Boolean is set to true, then it's going to set the x-axis 90 degrees clockwise of the y-axis. The next property to talk is the baseline type property, which is inside of the section labeled layout. And with the baseline type property, it's saying when you're aligning the objects, which edge of the current node should be aligned with which edge of its elder sibling. And this is used mainly for when you're adding fields relatively. So you're using relative positioning, or what's also called dynamic layouting. With decimal formatting, you can even line up based on the decimal format. Also within that layout section is something called floating behavior. And what floating behavior asks is, should the parent object ignore this object when it's doing its sizing? If an object is enclosed, then the answer is no. If the object is free, then the answer is yes. So in other words, do you want this object to always be enclosed in the parent object, or is it allowed to float free? The next two sections should be familiar to you from a variety of applications. The color properties, either color or background color, allow you to set the color. And if you click on the ellipse when you're entering in a color or a background color, it's going to bring up the window as we see here that allows you to select the color either by clicking on a preset, by clicking on a custom color that you've added, or by selecting from this chart or this graph of the range of colors that can exist. Under the font section, when you go to the font section, you're able to pick from a list of available fonts. And then you can also enter in font size. So the font size can either be entered in as points, 10 point, 12 point, 16 point, etc., or it can be expressed relative to the default font size. So if you want to make something perhaps like a header, you could say font size times 1.25. It would make it a little bit larger than the default font size. If you wanted to do make it a little bit smaller, like perhaps a note, you could do font size times 0.8. That would make it 80% the size of the default font size. Just a little few notes about selecting the font. Inside of GRE dir/bin/font info, we list the fonts that are available. There's also GRE dir/bin/font info PDF that lists those fonts that can be used in PDF documents. So not all fonts can be used in PDF documents. And when a font is not available, a system of fallback fonts is going to be used. And just a caution out here, the list of fonts on the Unix server where the GRE, the report engine, is located may be different than the fonts on the Windows PC where Report Designer is located. So you'll want to think about what fonts you want to use, especially if you're working between Windows and between Linux. And of course, as with any application, run and test your reports and view the result to make sure that the fonts that are appearing are the ones that you expect and that they're acceptable to you. The last three sections that are common across all objects is a section that involves the padding properties, a section that involves the border properties, and a section that involves the margin. So as you can see in this small image presented here on this slide, we have the padding around the content. The padding would be before the border, and the border would be before the margin. When you're setting these, you can set a general width, you can set a width for a specific top, right, left, bottom for the padding. When you get into the border, you can do the same, setting the width, top, right, bottom, left. You can select a style. You can select a style for each individual border. You can select a color, and you can select a color for each individual border. When it comes to the margin, again, you can give a general width, or you can give a width for a specific top, right, left, or bottom side. Well, how do you set these properties? We have a couple special cases where you can set a property by using the right-click contextual menu on an object in either the work area or in the structure view. However, most of the times you're probably going to be going into the properties panel or the properties view. After you've selected an object, you go into the properties view, and you have the choice to enter it directly into the text field. You could click on this little arrow icon to reset it to its default value, or you can click FX, and when you click FX, it's going to launch the expression editor. Inside of the expression editor, you can type your expression out. If you want code completion help, do control space, and that's going to open the expression assistant and list all valid next characters. In some cases, you're going to find it's a spin box if the property is numeric and qualifies for a spin box. If the list of valid values is short, it may appear as a drop-down list box or a combo box. And if it's a Boolean, it's going to be a checkbox, checked meaning true and unchecked for false. So that completes my look at formatting the objects that you're placing out on a report. There's a lot of formatting that we didn't cover here. Some of it we'll get into when we get into the chapters on printing out labels or the chapters on creating page headers and footers. However, if you do have questions and you need some more help, don't forget that two things. One, if I can't find my properties panel, I know I have to display it. And if I want to display it, I go to my window views and I look for properties. Now, if I'm looking at a property and I don't know exactly what it means, I have the option of opening up my help. And when you open up your help, it's going to start up, it'll open up the help, and one of the help pages is element properties. And inside of this element properties, I could go and identify a property that I want some more information about, and it'll give me details about that property.